Welcome to our celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Rosand Library and Study Center. I am Melissa Conn, the director of the Venice office of Save Venice, where the Rosand Library and Study Center is located. We welcome our guests on Zoom, as well as the people present in the Rosand Library today, including Ellen Rosand and David and Ellen's son Eric, with his wife Sarah, and their 3 children. We also welcome our many Venetian friends, scholars. Today, we've assembled a group of panelists on Zoom and in the library to discuss David Rosand's legacy. Mary Frank and Leslie Contarini will share with you how the Rosand Library was established with some behind-the-scenes information. 2 of David's former students, Frederick Ilchman and Lorenzo Buonanno, will reminisce about what it was like studying with Professor Rosand. Conservator Giulio Bono will tell us about David visiting the conservation worksite, while Deanne Bodar and Giulia Tagliaferro will share how David Rosand influenced their scholarship. I feel like David needs no introduction, but David was an American art historian and a Columbia University professor. He specialized in Italian Renaissance art and was known for his scholarly work on Venice and Venetian artists, and particularly Titian. He joined the board of Save Venice in 1998 and served as our conservation project director from 2003 until his death in 2014. Our first panelist is Mary Frank, an independent scholar specializing in art of the Venetian Renaissance, with a PhD from Princeton. In 2024, Mary Frank edited and prepared a publication which was a monograph on Paolo Veronese, written by David Rosand. Mary served on the board of directors of Save Venice for 10 years with David, and founded the Rosand Library and Study Center along with the board of directors of Save Venice. She'll be joined by Leslie Contarini, the Save Venice Programs Director and of our Venice office, with 19 years of experience with Save Venice.
Thank you, Melissa. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Okay, I'll speak up. David Rosand was, to me, a teacher, a mentor, and most of all, a dear friend. I took courses with him at Columbia while I was doing my work at Princeton, but I learned the most from him as a member of the projects committee, looking at restorations, looking at art firsthand in Venice. And here is a cartoon by Edward Conn, who was a good friend of David's, and he obviously understood David very, very well. In 2014, when it began to become painfully clear that David would not be with us much longer, he and Ellen and I began to dream of a place that would carry on David's legacy of scholarship, his knowledge of his love of looking at art, and sharing what he saw. We wanted to provide a home for his soul, his beloved library of art books, mainly on Venetian studies, but also ranging far and wide to Asia and abstract expressionism. And if you look around the room, you'll see books about Willem de Kooning and Robert Motherwell, as well as the good old standbys of Titian and Veronese and Tintoretto. David wanted most of all to keep the collection intact. Ellen Rosand told me that knowing that the books would be together and have a home in Venice, quote, made David smile with relief and pleasure. And so we are here today on what would have been David and Ellen's 64th wedding anniversary, celebrating the first decade of the Rosand Library and Study Center. I agreed to spearhead the task of making the library happen. It was an opportunity to provide an English language resource for scholars working in Venice, something that I knew from personal experience doing my own dissertation research here was sorely lacking in the city. I knew that it needed to be an open stack library so that that wonderful serendipity of research could occur when you find one book next to another, and really the one that you weren't looking for is the one that answers all your questions. It needed to be an inviting place with good light and comfortable chairs. When Ellen and I began making plans in the fall of 2014, just a few months after David's passing, we thought there were about 1,500 books. We believed that the existing office in San Vidal, which many of you may remember, would be able to accommodate them. Matthew White, the chairman of Save Venice at the time, and an architect and designer, made a floor plan that would accommodate 1,500 books, and he sketched a charming little round table where people could work. We decided to hire catalogers to catalog the books before they were shipped from Ellen and David's apartment where they were residing to Venice. And we found 3 remarkable women who were very sensitive to Ellen's situation at the time to go to her home and work what turned out to be day in and day out. I met with them in October of 2014 at Ellen's apartment, and these are people who know books and how much space they occupy very, very well. They looked around and they said, "This looks more like 4,000 books to us." And Ellen and I went, uh-oh. This called for decisive action. The book gods smiled on us because 3 nights later, Melissa found this space where we are sitting now because she was seated next to the woman who was our landlady at a dinner party. Talk about serendipity. We Save Venice decided to lease this space, which, as many of you know, is much larger than just this room, and everyone jumped into action. All the while, we were raising funds because all of this took a lot of funding. We received a grant from the Crest Foundation and launched a campaign to fill a golden book, a libro d'oro, with the names of all of the donors to the effort. And here is our libro d'oro, still being filled with names. I'm very gratified and grateful to say that people continue to make gifts to the library and continue to have their names inscribed in Antonio Forni's beautiful calligraphy in the book. We went into full speed preparation on both sides of the Atlantic. The librarians cataloged all winter, and it was a cold, horrible winter. Their work was complicated by the fact that David liked to use books essentially as file folders, tucking postcards, notes, and other random ephemera inside. Whenever the librarians came across this, the items had to be cataloged, cross-referenced to their original homes, and carefully archivally preserved. This took time. But by the end of March, as I said, working 24/7, the books were ready to go, complete with an ex libris, a book plate that featured a Zen drawing made in memory of David by one of his friends, Stephen Addis. And we had it, and so you can see this wonderful circle that is just drawn naturally, freehand and perfectly, and Johnny Basso printed it for us. And every book from David's collection bears this bookplate. We arranged the books in Ellen's apartment by call number, and here they are on the floor, arranged as they are on the shelves today here, and packed them this way in order to streamline the process when the books of shelving them when the books arrived here in Venice, because time was running out. In Venice, and here are all the books, and each of the boxes is labeled with the call numbers of the books inside them, 204 boxes altogether, ready to go in a container and be shipped on a freighter to Venice. Meanwhile, in Venice, studies were being made of the walls that could bear the load of bookshelves, and preparation shelves were being built, lights were installed, and so forth. And I have to thank Venini and Rubelli for providing lighting and fabrics and soft goods for the space. Unfortunately, the Venini lighting went the way. Where did it go?
It's in the hallway. It's in the hallway.
When a few years ago the ceiling was raised, but It was a very generous gift of both of them. And so the books went on the ship and the clock started ticking. And what you're seeing here is what I checked every day, which is an online position of where the freighter was. And you can see here that on May 20th, the container ship was still sitting off the coast of Genoa with no indication of when it might move. We knew that our opening date was June 18th and time was passing and I was nervous, but happily the books arrived by May 30th. And with that, I will let Leslie take the story over of how, as David said, this Save Venice became his home upon the waters. And this, what you're seeing here is the inscription in the copy of the French version of the Veronese, of his Veronese monograph to Venice, to Save Venice. Leslie? Let me just remove this.
Okay. So after their long journey from New York to Venice, the hundreds of boxes of books arrived by boat here at the water door on June 1st, 2015. Over the next several weeks, the books were methodically unboxed and shelved in their new home, thanks to the team effort of the Venice staff, our student interns, and a host of volunteers. Just a few short weeks later, and 10 years ago today, we celebrated the public inauguration of the Rosand Library Study Center on June 18th, 2015. We were joined by members of the Rosand family who are also in attendance here with us today. David's bequest also included his vast personal research archive, encompassing thousands of offprints, annotations, correspondence, and research notes, drawings, and photographs that are a valuable reflection of his multifaceted career as an art historian, teacher, and mentor. Some of these very drawings inspired the recent publication Titian's Poetics by Diane Baudart and Cleonice, which we will hear more about from Professor Baudart later in today's presentation. The creation of the library also facilitated easier public access to Save Venice's vast conservation archive, which features documentation pertinent to the restoration of artworks funded by the organization for more than 50 years. The earliest records date to 1968 and range from individual paintings and sculptures to significant sections about large-scale, multifaceted conservation campaigns with technical documentation in Italian. In 2017, Save Venice received a grant from the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation to reorganize and catalog the materials and publish a finding aid on our website. All archival material is available for consultation by qualified researchers in the Venice office. In 2024, the Rosand Library grew further with the addition of a selection of books from the library of Ellen Rosand. Ellen is a musicologist, historian, and opera critic who specializes in Italian music and poetry of the 16th through 18th centuries. Her gift benefited two institutions in Venice, with the Rosand Library receiving part of her collection, and the rest are now held at the nearby Fondazione Ugo and Olga Levi, which specializes in music studies. All of the holdings of the Rosand Library are classified with the Library of Congress system and are searchable through the online catalog as well as through WorldCat. The catalog is updated regularly, and work is now underway to add the holdings of books from the Save Venice office collection, which are also available for consultation. Access to the library is available by appointment, and we welcome anyone interested in visiting to reserve their space by sending us an email at rlsc@savevenice.org to make that appointment. The Rosand Library's public educational programming reflects David's commitment to scholarship and restoration through regular research and restoration roundtables, which bring together art historians, conservators, and other specialists, fostering dialogue about recent discoveries and new interpretations. The very first roundtable was led by Melissa Conn and Mary Frank on September 2nd, 2015. The library also hosts lectures and book presentations featuring the latest publications pertaining to Venetian studies. Since 2015, we have hosted nearly 50 of these public events, although that number would certainly have been much higher if not for the need to pause such events during the pandemic. Another key public outreach activity of Save Venice and the Rosand Library are cantiere aperte, or conservation worksite open houses, which offer the opportunity to go behind the scenes and learn about these important efforts from the restorers and specialists leading the work. Notable examples include Vittore Carpaccio's Centro Sulla Cycle at the Galleria dell'Accademia in 2018, and most recently, the Scuola Dalmata in December of 2024. Since its inception in 2015, the Rosand Library has offered opportunities for student internships and fellowships, hosting more than 40 young scholars from institutions including Lafayette College, the University of Cambridge, Columbia University, Wake Forest University, Harvard, the University of Chicago, Università Ca' Foscari, and the universities of both Melbourne and Sydney through the Australasian Centre for Italian Studies. Thanks to the support from the Frank Family Foundation, the annual summer internship program at Lafayette College allows 2 undergraduate art history students to spend 8 weeks in Venice, assisting the library and office and going behind the scenes at Save Venice's conservation sites around the city. In 2015, Lafayette College student Muriel Vaselli, who is there in the top left corner, helped unbox and shelve the books after their arrival and assisted our entire first summer of operation. This experience inspired her to pursue a career in library science. In 2020, while completing her master's degree in library and information science from the University of Maryland, Miri returned to Venice for a 3-month fellowship, caring for the collection, processing acquisitions, and updating the online catalog. We would also like to recognize the stellar work of past Rosand Library Fellow Mateusz Meyer. He's in the center top photo. After completing his master's in art history at the University of Cambridge, Mateusz dedicated time in 2017 and 2018 to organizing and rehousing David's research and ephemera archive and adding thousands of records of these holdings to the online catalog. Mateusz went on to complete his doctorate at Columbia University and today serves as the junior curator at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. We thank all of these young scholars for devoting their time and talents to assist Save Venice and the Rosand Library and Study Center. It is truly rewarding for us to see each of them fall in love with Venice, develop a deep appreciation for her art and architecture, and the valiant efforts underway to ensure its preservation, and then carry this experience and inspiration with them in their future pursuits. It is hard to believe that 10 years have passed since the Rosand Library and Study Center was established. Its continued growth and success would not be possible without the support of Save Venice's generous donors, and especially our founding patrons, Mary and Howard Frank. The gifts of individuals and institutions have further enriched the library's collections. We also thank the community of conservators, specialists, and public officials in Venice for participating in our many public events. Their shared dedication to increasing public awareness about the important work underway to preserve Venice's artistic patrimony allows us to share our mission with the world. We thank all of you for joining us today to celebrate this milestone, and we look forward to seeing what the future holds for the Rosand Library and Study Center. Now I would like to turn it over to Save Venice Chairman Frederick Ilchman and Professor Lorenzo Buonanno, who are joining us virtually to share their reflections as students of Professor David Rosand.
Greetings. Buongiorno. Hi, this is Frederick Ilchman, and I am speaking to you from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And yes, I agree with you, Leslie. 10 years. Can't believe it, right? It seems just like the other day the library was born. Now we find out that it's already in 4th grade. How'd that happen so quickly? Let me start just by echoing Mary's great points about what she was looking for in a library, because in a sort of ideal of a library, of course, you need books, right? An open stack would be nice. You'd like it to be comfortable, quiet, but welcoming, a word that Mary used often in describing her vision for this. You'd like comfortable furniture, attractive space. I never would put a great view of the Grand Canal as a requirement, but boy, is that a bonus. And Mary, thank you for working so hard to bring this vision to reality, and know that this is a great facility, certainly essential to the work of Save Venice, but so many other students and scholars and college classes coming through. All of that's quite something. But I also want to point out, just for certain big projects like the planning for the large Tintoretto 500 exhibitions that happened in the autumn of 2018, the Rosand Library was absolutely essential. It just wouldn't have worked without being able to go there before and after meetings with superintendency figures, the Curia, individual parish priests, conservators, curators from all around the world. People contributing the catalog, of which there, I see several on the screen right now. So this library was just made such a difference, knowing that you could find a book within minutes, right? Solve your question, double check something. That was so, so helpful. So thank you very much, Rosand Library. Thank you, Mary. Thank you for everyone who supports the library. It's a little gem in Venice, and we, all of us, really, not just me, but all of us are so grateful for this. So a minute about David as a professor. Now, I can't really call him David because for almost as long as I knew him, of course, he was Professor Rosand. When I was studying with him at Columbia taking classes, he was about my age, which seemed very old and august. And he was also notably much more relaxed than I was or am now. I was his TA for a course he did on 16th century Italian Renaissance painting, really memorable. I had asked him at the beginning, because where I had been an undergraduate, there were a handout at the beginning of every lecture class, which would have the list of the artworks, the artists, the life dates, sometimes a bit of bibliography. And I said, what about the handouts? And he said, well, I just don't usually do them, but maybe you're right. Maybe I should do them for this course. So he spent several weeks before the course began figuring out really beautifully, not just which slides, but the order that he was going to show them in. These are still 35 millimeter slides, of course. And then also the dates. And that's an important thing. And he wasn't just, looking, in the plates of Frederick Hart or Sidney Friedberg, but rather he was really thinking anew about the chronology of these artists. And I remember I put on my best blazer and tie and would sit in the front row trying to answer questions of the students about their extensions or what's going to be on the exam. But as I listened to these lectures, I was so impressed. I knew he was a great professor of Venetian art, and here, this is the later edition of the famous Painting in 16th Century Venice book. But his skill in Florentine art was really quite something. The way he talked about Andrea del Sarto, Rosso Fiorentino, Pontormo, really, really quite impressive. His lectures moving further afield on Parmigianino were very lucid, beautiful to understand. I was just so impressed there. Though I admit I was frustrated. As a younger person, I wanted facts. I wanted solid opinions quickly. I wasn't sure that I was getting them from him. These are burning questions. What is Bronzino's London allegory about? When was Titian born? Right? Come on. Who painted the concert Champetre? There has to be an answer. And he, David Rosand, Professor Rosand, would hesitate. He said, "Here's the evidence. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know." And he would admit that the answer is maybe not satisfying or not full, but here's the best we have to go by. And he said something that at the time bugged me, and now I realize it's wisdom. He said, quote, "A picture must be allowed to equivocate," right? That is, it doesn't necessarily have one meaning, or a work of art doesn't have just one interpretation. So pictures, I think, still, in many cases, equivocate. There are poems out there that we have not answered fully and may never, in fact, answer. A couple other things. He had beautiful handwriting, really beautiful, like Michelangelo, wonderful script. And to get comments on a paper or even a postcard from him in that beautiful script was so pleasant. He also loved to sketch, a natural artist. I remember during my oral exam at Columbia, there was the slide of Parmigianino's self-portrait in a convex mirror. I thought Professor Rosand was taking lots of notes. 15 minutes later, as I was talking, rather stumbling over my description of the painting and its importance in Parmigianino's career or the tradition of self-portraits, I looked at his page and he had done a nice little sketch of the Parmigianino painting. So he was an example of his mind being engaged by his hand and vice versa. Even though he would advocate for a picture must being allowed to equivocate, he was very decisive when faced by a deadline, respected very much a train trip we took from Venice to Rome, I guess in March of 2013. We were ostensibly going to see a Carpaccio painting being restored there and the big Titian exhibition at the Scuderia del Quirinale. But the real thing was the 3 hours or 4 hours on the train to figure out my dissertation, because I was down to the last few months. I had written a good first chapter, but that's all I had. I had done in 2009, and he'd been a contributor, this big exhibition catalog, Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, Rivals in Renaissance Venice. And I'd asked him, can I just count that? I wrote, half the book. Can I count that as my dissertation? He said, no. He said, a dissertation is different. This exhibition catalog is writing for a larger public audience, minimal footnotes, and you drove the bus, so to speak, but you didn't do all the work. Dissertation has to have the quotations in the original languages. You have to explore digressions, counter arguments. You have to put things in there to make it a thoroughly studied piece, and you need lots and lots of footnotes. And so I agreed to that. But then I said, okay, we're desperate now, Professor Rosand. How can I structure this bit, the remaining work to be done? So we spent those 3 hours, and Ellen was next to us on the train, going through the table of contents. So he'd say, okay, where does Pordenone come in? I said, that's chapter 2. He said, okay, great. Now, what about the miracle of the slave? What's that? I said, that's chapter 3. He said, well, okay, if that's maybe need to make it the end of chapter 2. And so he went step by step, figuring out when each topic would be addressed. And in other cases, he said, save that for an appendix. And then about 5 minutes later, said, no, delete it. You don't need that in your dissertation. That can become a future article. And so very decisive in just figuring out through the table of contents and very cleverly the title of each chapter, not just chapter 1, chapter 2, but what the point was going to be made there. He established the whole narrative arc. And when we got off the train in Rome, I was excited about Titian and to see the exhibition, but I was really relieved that I now had a plan and I could spend the next 3 months writing sort of 250 more pages to get myself across the finish line. And thank you very much, David Rosand, for guiding me in all this, particularly for his great comments on the drafts. His track changes even within Microsoft Word were somehow very eloquent. So a number of people on this call, on this meeting, helped me with various stages of the dissertation, including last-minute proofreading. Appreciate that. But David Rosand was the guiding light and the person after Tintoretto I think I owe the most to. Now I'd like to turn to someone I overlapped with in the last stages, but since he started much later than I, he didn't need decades to do his work. Turn it over to my friend, also in Boston, Lorenzo Bonanno.
Hi, Frederick. Thank you so much. Yes, I too am zooming in from not very far away from Frederick, in fact, so it feels funny to be on video. But let me also add my thanks both to Save Venice and, of course, to David Rosand and his family, to say that it was a privilege to have studied with him, to have been, I think I was his last dissertation defense. In fact, that picture I think right there is from my defense. It goes beyond an honor to have been involved and to have known him and learned from him. And I can only second everything that Frederick has said. I got to know Professor Rosand a bit later in his career, but everything that Frederick said held true: his sharpness, his dedication to his students, and also the remarkable generosity of both his time, but also his vision. He was not territorial, and he also impressed that upon us. Something that I like to remind people that he would say is that no one owns a topic. He said, don't be afraid to write about someone famous or someone that someone else has already written about, or who claims that they wrote the final word about so-and-so. This may have been born a bit from his frustration in his own career earlier, when I believe it was Rudolf Wittkower urged him to study Palma il Giovane, a wonderful painter, of course, but it was not his kind of first choice. And so he told myself, me and other advisees, don't be afraid. Just because someone else in Europe or at another university in the US is working on a topic, the two studies will be different. You will find your own way. And that was another aspect of his advising that I think was quite distinctive, that I remember very fondly. And that was his faith in his students to find their way, especially in those early stages, the first year or two of working on a topic, when one gets frustrated, one feels lost, whether it's in the archive or in the library, wondering what the original contribution is going to be or the direction of that dissertation. He always had faith that we would figure it out in the long run and produce something original. And it's that kind of generosity that really stuck with me all these years. And beyond a dissertation and a doctorate. I feel like I and many of us owe so much to him. I personally had thought that I knew Venice pretty well before I went to graduate school. I had the privilege of growing up with Italian family on the mainland of Venice and visiting very often. But through David Rosand and through him, Save Venice, I learned that I didn't know anything about Venice, a city I'd walked across hundreds of times, and became a whole new place. And that's again thanks to him. So I'm not sure how much time we have left here, but one of the last things I would like to note is many of these pictures here were taken in situ, as you can see, on visits with Save Venice, the board or donors. But we also went in class with him. There was perhaps my favorite seminar at Columbia was one on the Scuole Grandi, the confraternities of Venice, and Professor Rosand had arranged for for funding for the entire graduate class to go to Venice for more than a week. And that was a great adventure and one of the best learning experiences of our lives, not just because he took us to the exhibitions at the Accademia or to see the artwork that's usually in this or that church, but because we went behind the scenes. We went to restoration labs, we went up scaffolding, and the best thing in some ways was learning that although the rest of us were probably all in our late 20s, maybe in our early 30s, we were thoroughly embarrassed by Professor Rosand, by then in his 70s. The energy and stamina. He could run us absolutely ragged, even after an entire day from 9 a.m. till 4 p.m. He was tireless, and it was impressive and inspiring. And it wasn't out of trying to make us tired or overwhelm us. It was out of true, genuine love for the city and its artwork that he lost track of time. Even he would forget that it was 3 p.m. or that it was 7 p.m. and that we were still looking at artwork. It was just, you could see him rejuvenated. He was inexhaustible there, and a few of us were fairly fit, or others were much more fit than me. They were joggers and athletes, and we were falling all over the bridges of Venice trying to keep up with him. And it's this kind of enthusiasm that I hope we all can kind of maintain and pass on to the next generation. And that's thanks to David Rosand again. So I too want to say thank you loudly and for all to hear to David Rosand, his family, and to Save Venice. And with that, I think we're at time, and I'll pass it back to Melissa and Leslie. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Frederick and Lorenzo. It was really wonderful to hear your memories of working with Professor Rosand. Our panelists that are speaking on the legacy of David Rosand's scholarship are conservator Giulio Bono, who specializes in restoring works by Titian, as well as Diane Baudard, who is the David Rosand Associate Professor of Italian Renaissance Art History at Columbia University and the Faculty Chair of Columbia's Casa Muraro, and Giorgio Tagliaferro, Associate Professor in History of Art at the University of Warwick. So I'll now pass to Giulio.
Thank you, Melissa. First of all, I'm sorry for my Itanglish and say that I'm going on. I first met Professor David Rosand in 2005 in the restoration lab of the Galleria dell'Accademia when we were approaching the treatment of Gentile Bellini's Blessed Lorenzo Giustiniani. Then, in the following years, Professor Rosand visited us in 2006 and 2007 during the restoration of Jacobello del Fiore's Triptych of Justice, the Marcello altarpiece in 2007-2008, Tintoretto's deposition in 2008-2009, the Cataver frieze in 2008-2010, and then Titian presentation at the temple in 2010-2012. In the autumn of 2012, in occasion of the first maintenance phase of the Assumption of the Frari, Professor Rosand, in the company of Ellen, went up on the scaffolding to observe the painting close by. I remember very vividly that visit, and it was an amazing and very emotional experience for all of us. And it took, I think, an entire afternoon. I met then last time Professor Rosand in May 2013 when we were occupied with the vibrometric investigation transmitted by the organ attached to the back of the panel of the Assumption, and we were trying to understand what the effects of the stresses were on the painting. During all the visit, over the years, Professor Rosand didn't not speak much, but observed a lot in silence. When he had questions, his questions were always focused on the creative process and the execution technique of the artworks, and rarely concerned specific restoration procedures such as the cleaning process, the removal of the toning down patinas, and repainting applied during previous restoration. In those years, many art historians still considered un buon restauro un restauro che non si vede. And that means a good restoration to be a restoration that cannot be seen, meaning that conservative treatment must not change the appearance of the artworks in order to not to prejudice their visual history. Since 1980s, however, we learn, thanks to evolution of scientific investigation and technical study, that very often material applied during ancient restoration and badly aged are primary cause of serious conservation problem. Therefore, to stabilize the condition of the artworks, especially when they were located in original site with difficult climatic environment, it is essential to remove such materials with a consequent change in appearance that can be more or less evident. Professor Rosand has never argued negatively in this regard. With a very, very avant-garde approach from a scholar point of view, and I'm referring to long before the years in which I started my professional activity, because I'm remembering the story about the Pala Pesaro in the 70s. I think he evaluated the result induced by cleaning and the removal of material from previous restoration as an opportunity unique to better understand the nature of the artworks, their creative process, and the secret of their creators, mostly Titian. Even when material evidences that they were brought to light during treatment contradicted some previous assumption, Professor Rosand used the new information to advance his study revising previous hypotheses in a flow of evolving knowledge for him, but also for us, which were involved in the practical process. This proactive, supportive, and very empathic approach has motivated and made our work much easier during the year in achieving conservative aims. This allows us to act in the best way possible in stabilizing the artworks for the years to come, according to what we mean by preventive conservation. For this, I, as well as in the name of all my colleagues, I infinitely grateful. Thank you, Professor David Rosand.
So as for me, my first encounter with David Rosand was through his writing in the mid-1990s. At that time, I was turning into a book, my tesi di laurea on Titian and Federico Gonzaga, a work that I did under the supervision of Augusto Gentili. I was also starting my PhD on Titian and Spanish Habsburg portraiture with Daniela Haas. And in that framework, I was particularly obsessed by the lifelike quality that Renaissance sources attributed to Titian's portraiture. Famously, Vasari tells us that the miracle of Titian's painting happens when they are seen from afar. They appear perfect and seem to come alive, while from close side, the image dissolves into strokes and stains. Among David Rosand's extensive writing on this theme, there is one passage that acted on me as a revelation, a passage from The Stroke of the Brush that I first read in the French translation of 1993, La Trace et l'Artiste. Rosand observes that the substantiality of Titian's colorito calls, in fact, not for the distance, but for the proximity of the viewer, I quote, who is invited, Pace Vasari, not to stand back and squint until a focus illusion is obtained, but rather to approach, to respond to the tactile appeal of articulated stroke and surface, end of quote. This was mind-blowing and eye-opening to me because it made me realize how much our gaze as art historians is preconditioned by our knowledge of sources. It also made me look at paintings differently, examining the materiality of the pictorial process from close side and taking into consideration the pleasure of this intimate encounter with the auctorial mark. 10 years later, I had the pleasure of meeting David Rosand in person for the first time at a RSA panel in New York on Titian materiality, likeness, historia. We continue meeting from time to time at conference afterwards, and he very generously supported my work, particularly an application for a fellowship at Villa Tatti, which was another transformative moment in my career as a scholar. Unfortunately, by the time I arrived at Columbia University in the fall of 2013, there was not much time left to continue the dialogue. And I keep a very dear memory of our last lunch, during which we discussed Titian San Sebastian for the Gonzaga. Upon coming to Columbia, I gained a better understanding of the context that shaped Rosand's groundbreaking approach. I discovered that he was not only an intenditore dell'arte, but also a pratico dell'arte. His deep understanding of the making of paintings and his ability to inhabit Titian's studio were closely related to his artistic practice and familiarity with the contemporary art scene. And from this unique position, Rosand was able to reveal the modernity of Titian's painting and to investigate the auctoriality of the brushstroke. When 30 years after my first readings, I had the honor of editing David Rosand's selected essay on Titian, I wanted to highlight this aspect of his work process and to reconstruct how he was looking at Titian's painting by examining the textual and visual annotation he was used to do while observing the original works. Where should I click? Here. Yeah. Oops. No. Okay. So We have many examples of this drawing practice in the margins of the books that are conserved in this room, and in the loose sheets that were kept inside the volumes that Mary Frank and Leslie Contarini just mentioned to us, and also in the notebooks that are today in Columbia's archives. And I have to thank all the staff of Save Venice, as well as Ellen Rosand, for giving me access to this material and helping me navigate. We can follow how this drawing practice informed Rosand's knowledge of Titian's creative process through a constantly revived conversation with his paintings. I edited this book working closely with Cleo Nisse, who was mentioned before, and since the project was rather long, Cleo was my graduate student when we started. She wrote her entire dissertation on Venetian canvas during the whole editorial process, and by the time we finished, she had become my colleague and assistant professor at the University of Groningen, which was a wonderful experience, and it was also very beautiful to see how her work resonates with the legacy of Rosand's teaching conveyed through the vitality of his writing. My final comment will address the importance of the space where we are gathering today, a space that is significant not only because of the Rosand Library's rich collection of books, but also because it is a place of encounter, conversation, and exchange between art history and conservation, which is another constitutive aspect of Rosand's approach. I cannot thank Save Venice enough for making this dialogue possible and facilitating its development. In the last 10 years, it has been extremely beneficial, not only for my own research, but also for the work of our students, and several of them have been fellows here, as you have seen. Here you see a few photos of the first seminar on art and conservation in Venice that was held in this room some weeks ago, which we organized jointly between Save Venice and Casa Muraro. And we can see Melissa Conn and Gabriele Mattino presenting on the recent conservation of Tintoretto's crucifixion at the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, Giulio Bono presenting his work on the conservation of Titian's Assunta and the Pala Pesaro, and students from Columbia University, the University of Groningen, and Ca' Foscari examining the conservation files of Save Venice archives. The spirit of David Rosand's lesson was very much present in those days, a significant demonstration of how the Rosand Library admirably keeps the legacy alive by fostering new research and training new generations of scholars.
Thank you very much, Diane. So now we will turn to Giorgio Tagliaferro, who will be speaking.
Hi, Melissa. Hi, everybody. Hello. I am sorry not to be here in Venice. I'm in Warwick, and I miss being there very much. It's incredible. It's been already 10 years of the library. I'm very happy to be able to say something about David's scholarship because it's been very influential and still now on what I do as an art historian. I have to say that I read a lot of stuff by David, but the most influence I got was from him personally, and I very much agree with everything was said so far, and especially what Lorenzo pointed out about, and also Frederick, about the inspiration that you got directly from him. And it was also very generous as a person, and it's a very important aspect of history of art, working team, and make people link together. I remember that he's the one who introduced Lorenzo to me, and he said, I remember we were at an RSA in 2012. Do you remember that, Lorenzo? He came out of the room with you and said, the two of you must talk together. So, and I think he also is the person who introduced me to Frederick, probably back to the Tintoretto exhibition in 2007, or maybe we had met before for sure, but probably through David. But the few things I want to say today are very much about the breadth of his scholarship. Of course, is known to anyone who is a student in Venetian art, as a scholar in Titian, Veronese, and everything. I mean, everybody in the US reads this as the Bible, okay? This book with my stickers in it, I still use it. I came to read this book quite late as a student, because in Italy back then, English wasn't really, a requirement. But I have to say, his scholarship goes well beyond that, the confines of Venetian art. I find my own scholarship is focused on Venice. So you have this book on Titian's workshop and then Veronese. So David for sure was so important to me to understand, especially one aspect of this discipline that my training as an art historian in Italy, in Venice, had missed, which is the looking at artworks not just as texts, as sites where as kind of text where a literary subject is developed. Look at not just what is represented, but also look at the materiality and execution in terms of brush strokes, brushwork, and the structure of the paintings. That was what Diane has mentioned. So David was an art historian with an eye and had the skills of a connoisseur, but was not interested in attribution. His focus was on the brushwork, but not to discuss matters of pure style. And rather, he was interested in understanding the functioning of an artwork, the pictorial structure of a painting, and to track down the making process, the artist's moves and intention in making the artwork. He was trained as an artist and painter himself, and he combined this former hands-on approach based on direct, mindful observation and on analysis of technical processes with historical approach and examination of symbolical implication of artworks in relation to their context and especially their viewers, which is very important. And it's what I probably learned the most from him. He wasn't really interested in theoretical speculation in his publication. You won't find much of that, but he had a very strong conceptual framework underpinning this approach to the materiality of the paintings. And there is actually one article that he published that is theoretical back in 1974 in a journal that is called New Literary History. The site itself is quite interesting. The article was titled Art History and Criticism, the Past as Present. And it was a sort of manifesto that encapsulates his approach and still a good read. It was an attempt to investigate the state of the discipline of the history of art back then in the 1970s. And it raised one key question that still stick with me all the time. So it's, what are the ways we can view artworks from the past with the eye of the present? And I think we should do that. And what he called for in that article was, we art historians should be art critics, in a sense that we should absolutely seek for the methods to understand what we look at, the way we view it. So it's not just about historical context. And actually, in that article, he mentions the flaws of historicism, because our methods of style description, iconographic interpretation, contextual commentary, they all depend on external comparisons with other artworks, with cultural conventions, with social situations, but we have to go outside of the artwork. But his point was, and that's really what I learned very much from his scholarship, is that as a general principle, we should engage with the communicative functioning and the visual mechanics inherent in the work of art itself. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. I really appreciate your commentary. I'd like to leave the closing remarks to Mary Frank. We do thank all our panelists, but Mary, if you'd like to.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to all of our panelists. I will be brief. I also want to thank our audience. There are many faces that I recognize from 10 years ago. Thank you for your enduring support of this wonderful place. it is truly a dream come true for me to sit here. And I know that the Rosand family feels the same way. I'm going to get all choked up. I welcomed you before you got here, but I just want to say how much I appreciate all of your support over the years as the library was established and has grown. You've been absolutely wonderful to work with, and Ellen and Eric is here, and Sarah. Everybody, it's just terrific to have you here. Thank you. It's a privilege to use a word that came up several times tonight. I would be remiss to close without thanking the two women here flanking me, Melissa and Leslie. You are what make this truly go on. Interns come and interns go, and you take care of them and you guide them. But without your guidance and your support, we would not all be here tonight. So thank you very, very much. And I'm going to close, as I said, it's a dream come true. But I'm going to close by paraphrasing a remark that Ellen made in her remarks at the opening of the library. And she said, "David is gone, but a large part of him, his most valued possessions, are alive and will be for many years to come." Thank you all.
Okay, so thank you very much for everyone joining us in Venice and on Zoom, and we look forward to welcoming you in the future to the Rosand Library. Thank you. Goodbye.